Um, and yeah, just welcome. This is our session on innovation today and accelerating new technologies through these commercial partnerships. So we have some great speakers on the line. So we'll get started here. Just a little bit of logistics and housekeeping before we jump in. The session will be recorded. Recordings will be available within about 24 hours on our replay section of Hopin. We'll also be sending out official recordings about 2 weeks after this event. You can use the chat box to ask questions. So would love to have your questions coming in the either the chat or the Q&A. I'll try to monitor both, whichever you would like to use. And then at the end of the session, there'll be a survey on the right-hand side of the chat box. So make sure to fill that out and give us some feedback. So with that, I'll kick off the session. Welcome, Katie, Joseph, and Gary. Good to see you all. Excited to dive into this conversation today on accelerating innovation. So I will just kind of kick it off and maybe just with Katie, since you're really, the one that helped to convene us and get us all together here, would love to hear a little bit about the work that you're doing at Greentown Labs and, how you're thinking about bringing all of these startups and corporations together and why that's so important for decarbonizing these large industrial processes that we just heard about in our keynotes.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sherry. Great to be here today. Hey, everybody. My name is Katie Goyce. I'm Senior Director of Programs at Greentown Labs. As you may know, Greentown is the largest climate tech startup incubator in North America. And our mission is really to build an inclusive community that convenes, connects, and inspires entrepreneurs and ecosystems to advance climate solutions. And so as we think about that mission, we believe that corporate partnerships play a key role in helping to advance climate solutions. And that is because many of our member companies and many of the startups that we see bringing that much needed technology into the world are hardware companies and B2B. And both of those things mean that corporates can play a really important role in those startups' development. For one thing, as hardware companies, climate tech startups often need a lot of capital and very specialized resources and market knowledge, and corporates who are already playing in those spaces can provide those resources. And for another thing, B2B startups, their pathway to market is not easy. It can be a lot less clear how to access B2B customers than in a B2C model. And so corporates also play a really key role in helping bring the product to market, whether the corporate themselves is the one who's purchasing it or whether the startup is able to sell through the corporate to access some end user market. And so for that reason, we believe that corporate partners play a really important role in the commercialization of climate tech in particular.
Great. Thanks so much for joining, Katie. And Joe, I'll pass it over to you since Katie talked about, that corporate partner so much, and you work with large utilities. You, have participated in the Greentown's Accelerator and been that corporate partner, been that corporate kind of entity representative. Can you talk about that and what your motivations are for joining Greentown Labs as a partner?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Sherry. And for everyone, my name is Joe Steckley. I'm at EPRI. I'm a program manager for our low carbon resources initiative, which is focused on everything sort of low carbon fuels. And that's where we chose to actually have this partnership with Katie. And one of the drivers in the partnership is everything that Katie described about Greentown Labs. But in this space, we're in such early days in sort of these areas that we call or address deep decarbonization. And for us, our membership wants to begin to have that relationship, and our membership are largely utilities, both foreign and domestic, begin to have that relationship with these early stage companies so they can understand and familiarize themselves with the technologies that are ultimately going to be used. And so by partnering with Greentown, who already has an established history, has a number of startups and just eyes on them from that type of community, that when they put something out, a lot of people are going to respond to it. It was a great opportunity for us to build that relationship, access that community, and start to define how these technologies perform. At the same time, we bring some of the challenges that our membership already starts to see on the horizon with with deep decarbonization and some of the things that they're going to have to address there. And so really bringing together, that knowledge that we have from our membership and the relationships and the understanding of how to work with early stage startups that Greentown has is the motivation that brought us together.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll dive into a little bit more of what those challenges are from your members a little bit later in this chat. So thank you so much for joining. And then Gary, I'll toss it over to you as well. You've also joined one of Greentown's accelerators. Can you talk a little bit about the support you received and how that's helped you commercialize your technology and this, deep hardware tech that you're working on?
Of course, yeah. So I'm Gary Ong, and I'm the founder and CEO of Celodyne Technologies, and we're a hydrogen technology startup focused on basically enabling fuel cells for heavy-duty trucking, as well as making electrolyzers more efficient. So we were part of the H2 Refuel Accelerator back in 2019 with Greentown. It was co-sponsored by Toyota and Shell. The short version of this, it works. Shell's a current investor in Celodyne. And one of the biggest things we got out of our participation at Greentown is the strategy component. So we were one of the lucky few that got mentorship early on in the company. There was 2 people in there. And it's one thing to have a strategy of how to build product. It's another thing to have Shell's mentorship early on to be like, look, here's how you get to the market, and here's exactly what you need to build in order for this to actually have value for your end user, right? Because to Katie's point, hardtech's really expensive. Unlike kind of standard B2C kind of approaches where you can say, I'm going to iterate to perfection and get to my product market fit. Well, in hard tech, every time you iterate, it's going to cost you millions. So you don't really have that many options on iteration. So you have to get it right only after a couple tries. And that's why the strategy component was so important. It was important to build the right thing that your customers would want, something that's fully scalable, and then get it into the hands of the customer as soon as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that's a successful partnership all around for you, ending in that, or maybe starting in that investment from Shell. So to the next step of your company. So that was such a wonderful success story to hear about. And would love to dive into that a little bit more. Gary, can you talk about the role that the private sector creates in creating demand and markets for these new technologies such as yours? And maybe you can use that Shell partnership as an example.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, early on in that mentorship relationship, right? I think half the battle in technology development is kind of like a mindset thing. As a technologist, right? I'm always very excited about new technology. It's cool, right? It's like, wow, this is really cool. But when I think about launching a product into the market, honestly, I think technology pull is a lot more effective than technology push, right? If someone like a giant corporate says, I need X, right? And can you deliver it? And the specs are very clear. One of the beauty of a startup is that you're extremely nimble and you can basically customize anything and build anything you want. So that piece of information is critical. And I think one of the biggest roles for a large corporate is to be very specific in knowing what you're after and what you want, and be able to get that technology pull portion into it. And rather than like relying on just like the startup doing like the technology push aspects of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Joe, maybe you can fill in here too, because you did talk about, your members bringing those challenges to the startups and to others in the community at Greentown Labs, and really just tying that pool piece that Gary was talking about. Can you talk a little bit about that and the demand that you've seen from utilities, or maybe how they've identified the challenges and created that pool for new technologies?
Sure. Yeah. And I would say in the decarbonization space, within LCRI, for example, I think we have 54 members now, and I want to say 90% plus of them have net zero targets or 80% plus decarbonization targets. And so that in and of itself, obviously, is creating a demand for solutions in these areas. I think beyond that, the demand that they create is a demand to work with folks that are providing these sorts of solutions. Our membership does not expect to develop many of these technologies on their own. They're looking to the private sector to bring the solutions to them, and they want to understand, how these technologies work, what they do, and what they don't do, so that they can ultimately deliver what their mission is, which is to deliver reliable, affordable, and resilient energy services to their customers and their communities. And so the demand, again, that they're creating is for decarbonized solutions now that can meet those sorts of criterion. And so they come with, you know, the understanding of the things that it takes to deliver, you know, again, that reliable and affordable energy. And they come with questions about the technologies that are going to be able to do that in a decarbonized manner. And so that's really, I think, one of the interesting partnerships with the things that we're doing in working with folks like Greentown and startups is providing sort of those fence posts or those guardrails to the technologies, and saying we have a demand for decarbonized solutions, and then really allowing the private sector and startups and others to provide solutions that fit within those guardrails.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk about maybe one of those specific challenges, to just dive deep a little bit there, that you've seen from a utility that, you know, they've brought to EPRI and said, hey, you know, we're working on this specific challenge. Can you help us to find a solution for that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's basically EPRI in a nutshell. So everything that we do sort of fits that guideline. But you know, rather than call out a specific technology solution, I'll just even point to things like wind and solar. I mean, even today, you know, where I think many of us think that wind and solar technologies are relatively well developed, there's still portions of the United States and portions of the world where energy service providers are still getting their feet wet with these technologies. And so they'll come to EPRI, and the questions will range from, you know, what does this technology even do beyond just obviously how does it perform, you know, and beyond just delivering energy and electricity, they know that, but how does it perform? You know, what are the situations? What can we expect from the energy profiles that it will produce, to those that are further along sort of in their journey with these technologies, and they'll say, you know what, now we're in California, and we no longer have a midday peak. We've really got to focus on shaving afternoon and morning peaks, and what are the sorts of things that we can do, you know, with wind and solar itself, or what can we do by adding battery technologies, and how will those perform? And so, you know, again, I think the main takeaway with most utilities is that they're not looking to be the technology provider or the solution provider in these spaces. They understand, you know, sort of what it takes to deliver electricity in here, and so they have some set criterion that they can communicate on what needs to be done to be able to do that, and then work with technology providers to ultimately tailor the solution so that it meets their needs, while again, you know, serving that increasingly role on decarbonizing the energy services that they're providing.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more follow-up for you, Joe. As you know, Greentown Labs is a fantastic convener here, and we're going to talk about that in a second. But EPRI is a convener as well, and I know that, you know, you have LCRI. You mentioned that low carbon resource initiative, but can you maybe just touch on a little bit more of what that means and what that group does exactly?
Sure. Yeah. So the LCRI is it started as a 5-year initiative. We're probably going to go a little bit longer than that now, just with some of the success that we've had. But it's a set defined initiative in terms of time, with our partners at the Gas Technology Institute, and we really are focused on deep decarbonization. So it's moving beyond implementing things like efficiency and cleaner energy sources and electrification, and really looking at, you know, if you want to call it the last mile of decarbonization, and what are the solutions that are going to be necessary to be able to fully decarbonize the energy system. So we're looking at, you know, things like low carbon fuels, things like hydrogen and ammonia, but also solutions like direct air capture and carbon negative technologies to be able to achieve those net zero deep decarbonization goals. And really, our overall goal is to accelerate the development and the deployment of those technologies that are going to be necessary to achieve those goals, because we have a target of achieving those goals by 2050. if you look at the history of technology development in at least the electricity sector space, and I would say more broadly in general, the energy space, it takes about 30 years to go from the lab to really even sort of N equals 1 or serial number 1 in the commercial space. And so that we don't have 30 years to do that anymore, do we? So we're really focused on how do we accelerate that process and get these technologies out there more quickly so that we can achieve that decarbonization target that we've set.
Yeah, absolutely. So absolutely makes sense to join an incubator accelerator such as Greentown Labs. So Katie, I'll turn that over to you because Joe did talk about accelerating technologies, which is, I know, core to what Greentown Labs does. So can you talk a little bit about that, about how you accelerate technologies and how you act as conveners to do that?
Absolutely. I should start off by saying there's really two ways that we involve corporate partners in our Greentown Labs ecosystem. One is through our Incubator Partner Program, which is where we have a variety of corporates who engage with our member community in a variety of ways, really focused on making as many connections as we can, as many high-value connections as we can to really spark those relationships. And that program is led by some of my wonderful colleagues on our partnerships team. And then our other side of the house in the partnerships team is Greentown Go. And those are the programs that my teams lead and the programs that both Joe and Gary have been a part of. And so those programs are really focused a little more narrowly on one or maybe two partners at a time in a given technology area. And so, for example, Joe is a partner, Joe and EPRI are a partner on our low carbon hydrogen accelerator that we're currently leading. And the approach that we take in those programs is really to sit down with the corporate partner and the cohort of startups and ask them to chart out where they want to go together. What is the long-term vision for collaboration that is going to propel the startup's technology to market in a way that wouldn't happen otherwise? We usually see 3 buckets of partnerships that partners and startups can consider together. One is what we might call a supply-side partnership, and that's where the corporate partner would like to become a customer of the startup's technology. And so I think Joe is describing some great examples of that, where different member utilities would love to become a customer to some of these startups to bring that clean electricity supply into their systems. And so supply-side partnerships are certainly one type of really valuable partnership that gets that technology out into the market. Another would be on the demand side, and this is for corporates who are looking to strengthen their own competitiveness in a greener economy. And so examples of demand-side partnerships might be licensing deals or joint development agreements or co-selling agreements, where the corporate's not the customer per se, but they are helping to bring that technology to market to their own customers, and they are participating in some of the economic benefit of bringing that technology to market. And then finally, we also see equity partnerships, and so those are certainly investments. Gary is a great example of that. The investment that Celadine received could go so far as to have an acquisition. That would probably be the most extreme example of an equity partnership. And usually we find that equity partnerships are pursued in concert with either a demand side partnership or a supply side partnership. More and more corporates are looking for that strategic alignment in the investments that they make. And so those are really the 3 buckets of partnerships that we see partners and startups pursuing together. Once they've aligned on where they would like to go together, we encourage them to build backward and think about how are they going to unlock these partnership outcomes. It's no small thing to make that happen. There's a lot of people that have to be convinced, tech that has to be tested, gates that have to be unlocked to reach one of those supply side, demand side equity partnerships. And so in our accelerator programs, our Greentown Go programs, we encourage folks to think about what's the information that can be shared so that the partner and the startup know each other better, build trust, understand the technology and the market opportunity, and what can they test together, be it the tech itself, the performance of the tech, be it an integration of 2 different technologies, or be it a market hypothesis. What can they test to unlock one of those partnership outcomes? And so that's really how we think about it. Where are you trying to go? Are you looking for a demand side partnership, a supply side partnership, or an equity partnership? And then how do you get there? Through information sharing and testing of hypotheses.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And Gary, like you said, Katie is a prime example of that. So Gary, would love to turn it over to you. And, you mentioned this at the start about this recent investment by Shell Ventures that started with this, partnership at Greentown Labs. Would love to hear a little bit about that journey and what led to that investment to maybe many of Katie's points there.
Yeah, so Shell was an interesting one, right? When we participated in the accelerator, there was no talk of funding, actually. There was no talk of any equity partnerships or whatever. It was literally just mentorship. They were trying to help us get our footing, so to speak, right? And then after that, we started working with folks at Shell TechWorks. And then one thing led to another and everything. And then maybe like 12 months later or even longer than that is when the equity stuff came in. So at that point, it was almost like, yeah, the money's nice, but I mean, that's not that wasn't the main point anymore, right? At that point, it was like, the relationship was valuable enough that the money was just an added benefit, right? But I think our work with Shell was kind of emblematic, I think, of how corporate partnerships within startup might go. It's rather organic, definitely not like a hard sell where it's like, I want you to give me money into my company. Strategic alignment is quite important. In fact, it was one of those, you can speculate all you want about how your company might align or might not align with a corporate, or you can just talk to them and then have that be verified. I think that's one of the big benefits of accelerators like the ones that Greentown hosts, right? You get that kind of information verbatim from people in that community. There's no guessing of, I think Shell cares about this. It's like, no. I have Shell in the room right here. So they care about this. We're good now, right? And that's actually extremely valuable, especially for a startup early on trying to save resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you speak about a little bit about the way that Shell was set up? I know in our lead up to this call, we talked about, the corporate venture capital side wasn't the original team you worked with. Can you talk about how those different stakeholders were brought in to really be a part of that deal and what made that a success?
I think so. The way we had it was basically we were engaged with folks over at, there's this division of Shell called TechWorks, which is kind of like their agile innovation team within Shell. I think a bunch of people in that division actually came from the startup land. And so it started there, mentorship, and then it went become towards like light validation through Fraunhofer and so forth. And then after that led to, we got connected into the CVC team, and then that led to the investment, right? So I owe a lot of that kind of success to that team at Shell Tech Ventures, at TechWorks. Like, I can't even begin to tell you how much I owe them. Like, it was a big deal. They're the ones who got us connected to like experts in Norway, basically anywhere around the world for Shell.
Yeah, and do you have maybe 1 to 2 tips for startups that are looking to work with corporations? Like, how did you successfully navigate that partnership?
I do. 2 quick tips, right? The first one is spend a lot of time on strategic alignment with the corporate, right? Not just like I want you to buy something, or I want you to like invest in my company or so forth, right? But actually spend a lot of time figuring out the strategic alignment. I'll give you a concrete example, right? For us early on, how did Solidigm align with Shell's vision, right? Well, from the electrolysis hydrogen production side, right? That one's obvious because like, yeah, it makes sense to do hydrogen. But halfway through the mentorship, there was actually a lot of interest in our fuel cell side of development too. You might be like, why that? Why is Shell interested in hydrogen usage for fuel? Well, it's quite simple, right? Because if you enable hydrogen usage as fuel, it significantly increases the demand side output of hydrogen. So it lets you scale down the cost of hydrogen just from raw supply. That's why it matters, right? So that's an example of like a strategic alignment I would not have realized until I talked to them. Otherwise, you'll be like, yeah, Shell cares about our technology. Why? Because they're trying to make hydrogen. It's like, no, it's actually both sides. You need to be more nuanced about it, right? So number 2 is, I would say, for startups, we're all in the business of going really quick and really fast. So sometimes working with a giant corporate can feel a little ball and chain, because you're like, wow, things are very slow, etc. Or why are the requirements so stringent and so forth? I would just say maybe be a little bit more empathetic about it. It's like one example, right? Which actually led to a product we developed was a durability metric early on that we found out through Shao. It was like, well, we want, this like kind of 3-year improvement is great, but I want you to get this to like 15 years, which is actually the first Gen 1 product for our thing. And I was like, why? Why do you care about this for 15 years? And they're like, well, Gary, I want you to take my perspective for a moment. Imagine if you were running this plant and this is on the ground and has to produce hydrogen. How many years do you think before I get my money back? Like, honestly, right? And it's like, oh yeah, no, you need 15 years. Okay, fine, that makes sense. So things like that, right? You're more empathetic to a large corporate, and then after that, you're able to take their perspective and realize just how many stakeholders they have to line up within the company just to basically help you, right? And once you're able to kind of take that perspective, I found that like having that working relationship kind of end with a good result is much higher.
Yeah, those are some great tips there. And, I'm sure that the others on this line, Joe, Katie, can really empathize and understand those perspectives too. And, Joe, maybe passing it back to you, since you do work with a lot of utilities and those are your member companies, and talking about these kind of, longer timelines. Can you talk about maybe one success story that you've seen where a utility has come to you with, a specific need and a challenge, and you all helped to find them a solution, and what happened there?
Sure, yeah, and so we're certainly going to have some of those come out of the low carbon hydrogen accelerator, but we're early days there. So EPRI also has a program that we run that's something of a technology accelerator as well, called Incubate Energy Labs. And we do this with a number of our member utilities are a partner of this effort. It's been ongoing for about 2 or 3 years now. So we've had a couple of cohorts and a little bit of history there to build up some success stories. And so you can go on EPRI.com, and there is a report out that is publicly available for the 10 startups that were in the first cohort in 2019 and the 20 that were in the second in 2021, and there's actually a cohort for 2022, but they're still in the midst of that as well. But and in there you can see sort of the projects and the efforts that were worked on together. But already coming out of efforts like that, we've had companies and outcomes that really span the gamut. So each one of those 30 or so efforts that I talked about was a company working with a startup, working with EPRI, working with at least one member utility, in some case more, on a defined project or problem. But coming out of that, we've had a number of follow-up efforts that again have really spanned the gamut. There was a project by a company called EV.Energy, where they worked with Ameren, who's a member utility, that ultimately, after they demonstrated success in that project, they've gone on to raise a number of additional capital rounds to further develop their technology. We had a company called Shark Energy that was working on wastewater heat recovery. They did their demonstration, and then they've gone on to do some larger demonstrations with member utilities based upon that effort. And then I've talked about most utilities aren't interested in owning IP in this space, but that's sort of the interesting thing working with utilities is you can't make a general statement about all of them. And so there have been acquisitions. We worked with a company, EIQ Mobility. They did an effort under Incubate Energy Labs, and then they were ultimately acquired by NextEra. So we've even seen acquisitions come out of some of these efforts like this. And so I think, again, there's a lot of successful outcomes, a lot of the benefit, and a lot of the success derives, though. And I think Gary did a great job of highlighting it and really working together in a partnership and understanding sort of where a lot of these utilities, where these corporates are coming from, and understanding your technology well, not compromising on anything there, but tailoring it to truly understand what the needs are of those corporates. And in our case, we've had a lot of success in building together and working on those relationships and ultimately having successful outcomes.
Yeah, those are some great examples, and good to hear that there are so many examples of success stories. I want to kind of open up a question to all of you, or that's kind of coming up for me, and maybe came up on the prep call, that talks about this tension between the shorter, fast-paced startup life, shorter timelines needing investment, needing to move quickly, and then these kind of longer timelines that corporates or utilities work with. What is that tension like, in the real world? How have you seen both sides of that overcome it? Or maybe that's just an ongoing reality of what we're facing with, the industry right now.
Well, I mean, I can make a stab at getting us started, and I'm sure the others can add more insightful comments. I mean, I think the tension exists, but it exists in different ways, and maybe sometimes it doesn't exist depending on the technology that you're working on, right? So I think I think the utilities know that they have a reputation of piloting technologies to death. That's something that's been said quite a bit about utilities. I think they understand that with decarbonization, there's a need to move faster. There's a need to work with companies that are under some of the constraints that startups are under when you have money from VCs or others that has relatively shorter time frames to turn around and really see successful outcomes, so that either more money can be raised or the investment ultimately ends up being successful. I think in the software space, you are seeing utilities being willing to adopt solutions that a bit more rapidly, again, depending upon where they're going to integrate into their systems. But I think at the end of the day, the tension is going to be there, because utilities, take very seriously their role in delivering reliable, and reliable means, very, very near 100% of the time having energy services available to their customers, and they take very seriously their charge to do that affordably. And so it's more the reliable side that is going to cause them to move slow, because they're going to have to be comfortable with technology solutions, so that when they think about integrating them into their systems, they are comfortable that this is not going to cause a disruption in the services that we're providing our customers, because frankly, we're all customers of electric utilities, right? And anytime the power even goes out for a second, you have to go reset that microwave clock or whatever else it is, right? We all complain about that, and that's something that's that's more mundane. There's actually real world implications to having power outages, right? That are serious and can affect people's lives in dramatic ways. And so utilities take that responsibility seriously, and that's where I think a lot of that tension comes from, wanting to move very quickly, while having to understand on the utility side, they have a responsibility to their customers to have the power and to have the lights on 100% of the time with no disruption.
I mean, I can chime in. I actually think that the tension's a good thing. Basically, I think that startups sometimes can move a little too fast, right? So, I mean, you remember, right? So we're not in software too, if I remember that, right? So in hard tech, for instance, if I send out a new product, say a new hydrogen technology, right? It is quite important for that thing to work exactly as I intended to be, and there are no problems with it. Because if there will be issues. So it's a good thing to be a little bit cautious when it comes down to hard tech, and maybe that slight slowdown is not a bad thing, right? On the counter side, the startup wanting to move quicker than expected is a good push, also, right? For your partner that might go a little slower. But more importantly, right, I think really it comes down to this, right? So you and your corporate partner have a long-term vision and a long-term goal of where you want to be, right? And at least speaking from the startup side of things, right? From a startup side, what we care about is knowing what we have to do in the next, say, 12 to 18 months and why. And then after that, what happens in the 12 to 18 months after that. So everything is very thoroughly milestoned out, right? So for instance, to make a concrete example, right? So you might speak to a partner and they say, you know what, we're not comfortable with the scalability of your material yet. Okay, that's fine. That's actually perfectly acceptable. So let's talk about how do I make you comfortable about the scalability, right? What are the necessary milestones to get there? And then help me plan out what, you have experience with scaling, clearly, otherwise you wouldn't be telling me you're not comfortable with scalability. So help me plan out what would scalability look like and its execution plan, right? And then I'll find a way to get it done and I'll get it funded. And I'll see you in 12 to 18 months and we'll check in every quarter, right? So the scary one is when there's not that plan after the discussion of like, oh, we want to do a pilot. As long as that plan is there, I actually think that the long-term vision and the short-term execution aligns. The startup is quite good at pivoting and getting stuff done in the short term so that you can, at the end of the day, partner and fulfill the long-term vision of the partnership.
Such good points. I love your acknowledgement, Gary, that like maybe that tension is a good thing, because that's the world that Greentown lives in, right? We are constantly at the crossroads of these two very different cultures, and trying to understand how to help them work more productively together. I think what you just said about having the long-term vision clear is critically important. I'll also say that our Greentown Go programs provide that level of accountability so that we know there is a framework. We know that we are moving forward with a deadline because the program is time bound. And a lot of what our team does is try to take as much de-risking off of the project management side of the program as we can so that the corporate partner and the startup can focus really on those partnership conversations. And so the framework that we put around our programs is really built to de-risk as much as possible. And allow the partner and the startups to focus on those strategic conversations through navigating their own internal change management and approval processes and trying to go quickly, but without risking the quality. Because it's hard. It's a really hard balance, but it's really important to try to get right.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like we have a question in the chat here that we can address in these last few minutes. In one of the keynotes, it was mentioned that we can meet 90% of net zero goals with the tech that exists today. Can you talk about what corporations are looking for in startups, new ways of doing things, new tech, etc., and why? To anyone who wants to take that one.
One answer I would give to that is that yes, the 90% of technology that exists today, that really resonates. But that doesn't mean that there aren't new use cases or new applications or new ways of making that technology more economical, easier to install, more straightforward. And so many of the innovations that we see, some of them are completely new innovations, but many are also around that case of maybe it's not something brand new, but it takes something that exists and makes it all that more economical or all that more easy to implement for a large and complex organization. And so there is plenty to solve for still, both in technologies that have already been invented and have yet to be invented.
Yeah, I would just, add to that. It's sort of all of the above in terms of new ways of doing things, new tech, and all of that. I mean, I think the why is simply that even within the technologies that exist to decarbonize the grid or energy services more broadly, you do see these challenges like I mentioned earlier with solar carving out the middle of the day. There's ways that you can modify that technology so that it can go further and do more things in terms of decarbonizing. And so there's different ways that you can deploy it. There's different technologies that you can utilize. And I think, adding to that or improving upon that technology is something that people are certainly interested in. But I think they're also, the challenge is 90% is not 100%. And so we need new technologies that can meet those hard to decarbonize or those sectors that don't fall within that 90%. And it's not necessarily going to be as simple as just taking the existing solutions and tweaking them a little bit to provide those energy services. And frankly, that, like everything else, right? I mean, in startups and everywhere, everyone talks about S-shaped adoption curves and everything else. The last 10% in some ways is going to be the hardest 10%. And so really getting started and identifying potential solutions and weeding through what do technologies do. I think at EPRI we don't say that things are better or best, but we want to understand what they do and don't do, so that people can choose the solutions that are going to be best for them, because the solutions are not going to be universal. What is a solution in the United States is not going to be necessarily the right solution for Europe, and it's not going to be the right solution for folks that are in Asia. And so really it's new tech, but it's understanding what the tech does and doesn't do. And so I think we need to do all of that. And it's new ways of doing things. It's new tech. It's new business models.
And I'll just add to that, right? So from a technology development standpoint, right? I like to tell people that quote is correct, right? I know when someone comes to me and they freak out about climate change, they're like, "Oh my God, we will never solve this." Well, the good news is this, right? Like the tech that we need to decarbonize and fix climate change exists, right? It's not like you're hunting in the dark and it doesn't exist yet and you've got to invent it in the next 2 decades, right? And I was like, and it exists, but it still needs to be improved from an economics standpoint, right? I'll give you a concrete example, right? For Celerine's products, for instance, one of the things we do is we extend the durability of fuel cells so that you can use it to replace a diesel engine. Fuel cells exist. Are they durable enough? No. But can they be made durable enough? Well, we're doing it. So to that point, right? It's like, well, now why do you care about durability? It's a function of economics, because you have to be able to get the total cost of ownership for the thing low enough so that you can replace its incumbent technology. Now, if cost was not the concern, right? I like to tell people that the situation of infinite money, then no, absolutely no problems with technology, right? But that is not the reality that we live in. So on the optimistic side of things is to say, yes, we have the technology to decarbonize. Now the question is, can you use that technology in a way that make all the economics make sense so that ultimately you can decarbonize? One of the biggest reasons for startups is you can drive the technology curve rightward as fast as possible towards maturation, so that you can drive the cost as low as possible, as quick as possible, so you hopefully you can decarbonize faster rather than the current pace that we're at.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, really, really good one, and one that will, I think, continue to face in the next, 30 years as we're heading towards these goals. So I know we're getting down to the end here, so I will just wrap it up with one last question for each of you, maybe 30 seconds to a minute each. But what is something our audience can take away and deploy tomorrow in their organizations to start implementing some new innovations or these new technologies that already exist? And Gary, I'll start with you.
So I would say work fast. I mean, if you want concrete ones, hire a bunch of people that were previously working at startups or accelerators and start an innovation team that works at the same rate as the startup, right? Speed is paramount at the end of the day. Not necessarily speed in partnerships, speed in information. So work fast. Number 2 is be very specific. With a startup, if you tell me exactly what I need to build and the value proposition is clear, you'll be surprised how fast I can get it done. So be fast and be specific. Yeah, that would be the 2 quick advice.
Great, thank you. And Katie?
I'll go next. I want to piggyback on that. I would say that, yes, I think corporations should hire lots of innovation teams, and the people at those innovation teams should build strong relationships with either or both their procurement folks and also the lines of business. We see that those relationships are critically important to being able to move quickly, whether it's a technology that you want to buy and install within your corporation, or if it's a new business area that you want to get into. And so having that strong connectivity, those strong relationships, putting in that work ahead of time helps the innovation move faster.
Great, thank you. And Joe, you get the last word here.
All right, well, great. Yeah, and I'm at EPRI, so I couldn't get out of something without saying get out there and collaborate. EPRI talks about collaboration, but I think that's critically important in all these areas. Is what we've largely been talking about here is collaboration. I would encourage folks to not be afraid of collaboration. I think often in especially earlier stage companies, people get overly concerned about IP, and it's not that you shouldn't have your IP protected, but I think there are a host of organizations out there that are more interested in working with you and understanding what your technology does and doesn't do, and helping you make it work in a setting and be a solution for what their needs are. And so I would say don't be afraid of collaboration and be actively collaborating if you want your technology to ultimately be adopted.
Great. So work fast, be specific, build strong relationships, and collaborate. I love it. Thank you all so much for joining me today. Some great takeaways, and yeah, have a wonderful week. Thank you to the audience for joining as well. Enjoy the rest of Electrify.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.